burgeoning crisis on the ground in Syria itself. I'll be talking to the founder of Médecins Sans Frontières, whose hospitals have been persistently bombed, and to voices from Russia and America. We also have a rare and powerful report from the embattled rebel sector of Aleppo. Theresa May tells me who needs to stop bombing, but not how they will be stopped.
What is key to this is that the Syrian regime stops bombing its own civilians indiscriminately in the way that it is, causing such suffering and hardship to its own people.
Also tonight, as the Conservatives chew on the politics of Brexit, in the city the financial implications as the pound slumps to a 31-year low. We reveal how austerity has taken a toll on the most vulnerable. 80% of English councils we surveyed have cut funding for disabled people. Are the councils or central government to blame? And
my grandfather was a king. I am his heir. I have a responsibility to return home to my people.
An African prince who married an English woman challenged racial prejudice and changed the course of history. Now the star of the film hopes the big screen retelling of this true story will help overturn racism in Hollywood.
Until the demographics of the decision makers change, we are not going to see enough movies, TV programs, media that reflects the society we actually live in.
So we're going to be devoting a large part of tonight's programme to the intractable crisis in Syria. A little later, we'll have another dramatic report from inside the besieged city of Aleppo, showing the vast armoury of the rebels making a military solution untenable. But there is little hope either on the diplomatic front, with the United States calling off its cooperation with Russia over Moscow's failure to deliver on its commitments to peace, and the aerial bombardment of besieged Aleppo continues relentlessly. Matt Fry has our first report.
Aleppo's daily dig for life, or the miraculous remnants of it. Watch closely and you can see a foot stir in the tangle.
Bismillah.
This kind of excavation has become routine here again, ever since the ceasefire collapsed and Syrian and Russian jets resumed their daily business. Although the results aren't always this heartening. In Aleppo, those fortunate enough to be born again can never be quite sure of how long their second lease of life will end up lasting. That may depend in large part on a man who could be found more than 2,000 kilometers from East Aleppo in the southern Ural Mountains at the same time as the bombing, feeding an endangered species of wild horses. Why the combat fatigues, you may well ask? Was Vladimir Putin anxious not to frighten the horses, or does the attire fit the mood? On Monday, he suspended an agreement with the US to dispose of weapons-grade plutonium, while the US suspended talks over Syria. Cold War tit-for-tat is back, and gloves off.
We acknowledge in sorrow, and I have to tell you with a great sense of outrage, that Russia has turned a blind eye to Assad's deplorable use of these weapons of war that he has chosen, chlorine gas, barrel bombs against his people. And together, the Syrian regime and Russia seem to have rejected diplomacy in furtherance of trying to pursue a military victory over the broken bodies, the bombed-out hospitals, the traumatized children of a long-suffering land.
Unfortunately, from the very beginning, there were many who wanted to ruin the agreements, including from within the US administration.
So where did it all go wrong?
The time is now.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much.
For most of the year, the two foreign ministers seem to have eloped.
We achieved clarity.
At least a dozen visits since December.
I think we need to refrain from emotional reactions.
I listened to my colleague from Russia. They're sort of in a parallel universe here. I mean, this is not a joke.
But their relationship was undermined here by the hard reality of different war aims. These are Syrian government tanks in Aleppo. Ever since Russia got involved on his side, President Assad believes that he can win his civil war, so why sue for peace? America wants above all to defeat ISIS. Washington and Moscow have different goals and different levels of commitment, but unless they work together, there can be no peace in Syria. Caught in the middle, those who shouldn't be. This was the latest hospital bombed apparently by Russian jets in Hama. One of the largest in rebel hands, this hospital had been built into a cave for safety. And in Geneva, a sobering if bizarre reminder that no side has a monopoly on bombing hospitals. This ceremony used the facade of Geneva's main infirmary as a screen to commemorate the bombing of a Médecins Sans Frontières hospital in Kunduz in Afghanistan last year. That bombing was by American forces.
Matt Fry there. And earlier I spoke via the internet to Ismail al-Abdullah in Aleppo. He's an anti-Assad activist and humanitarian worker with the White Helmets, a volunteer group operating in rebel-held territories. I began by asking what he's seen in the last few days.
They are targeting the hospitals, targeting the civil defense centers, targeting every crowded point of people. And this is a new strategy, and using the new weapons, bunker buster bombs, cluster bombs, phosphorus bombs. For the hospitals, one of the largest hospitals in Aleppo City was targeted 3 times.
Were you on call when the large hospital, the M10 hospital, was targeted? Did you see the immediate aftermath? Tell us what you witnessed.
I saw the site of the barrel bomb, then I saw the operation rooms, and the rooms for the injured people were destroyed, and the equipment. Doctors said that they can't go on with this hospital.
There have been several opportunities for people to leave. Why do you think people are still staying? How long do you still plan to stay?
I'm staying here. I'm staying because it's my choice, actually. It's my choice. I'm living alone in Aleppo City. My family left Aleppo City since 3 years and a few months, and I stayed alone here, and this is my choice. And I believe in my choice that I'm doing something to help my people. I'm staying as long as the people are staying. When the people leave, I will leave. If they stayed, I'm staying. In the other side, I'm actually my heart in this city, and I can't leave it. I can't leave it. I tried, but I couldn't.
What kind of impact is this having on you? You have been part of the White Helmets for several years now. What toll is that taking on you?
Actually, I'm proud of myself, and I'm proud of this job, and I'm proud that the White Helmets, and it's a nickname. We were civil defense volunteers, and now White Helmets, and it's big. It's big, and we are so proud. I am one of the guys who I'm proud, but I'm really tired. I'm exhausted, and I think I don't know. It's impact. We're tired. Actually, we're tired. We are tired of pumping, seeing blood, seeing pull the kids from under the rubble, pull women, pull old women. Yeah, it's a horrible situation.
When you in the White Helmets are called to an area that's been hit, do you help anybody you see injured, or would you?
Of course.
Or would you see someone who you think, right, they're one of the extremists, I'm not going to help them? Is that something you would discriminate or not?
No, actually, we help everyone, and we mean everyone. Everyone who needs our help, we will help him, because he is a human being and he suffers and he needs help, so we help him.
Ismail al-Abdullah speaking from eastern Aleppo, where the siege has been intensifying since the summer, with thousands of civilians caught in the violence. In August, disparate rebel groups, including those linked to al-Qaeda, united for the first time on the battlefield to try to break the government's stranglehold. Our report tonight shows a rebel group fighting in the Ramusa industrial area in the southwest of the city in a major offensive to seize a Syrian army base. The rebel advance came from 2 sides. One group of jihadi fighters attacked government lines from outside the city. At the same time, a coalition of rebels targeted the same army base from inside besieged Aleppo. Christian's report, filmed by Syrian cameraman Abdul Karahabak, gives a glimpse into why Syrian and Russian forces have so far been unable to retake the whole of Aleppo.
We all know about the siege of East Aleppo. This is the story of one small but famous victory as rebels fought back against the forces of Bashar al-Assad. These men are all Syrian. Once farmers and factory workers, they are now Islamist fighters.
اتركوا من قتل الشعب ونوجه رسالة لكل من حمل سلاحه ووجهه ضد الشعب السوري ضد أهله اترك السلاح قبل أن نأتي إليك. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قصف مرتزق جواد الإيراني في الذهبية. قصف الكلاب المنسحبة. الله أكبر. الله أكبر.
Note how they call the enemy Iranians, not because they all are, but because that's now a term of abuse for anyone who isn't Sunni. The sectarian language is partly why so many civilians in West Aleppo are frightened of these rebel fighters. It's early morning and they're planning an attack. Their way of defending East Aleppo is to hit back by sending suicide bombers to the Syrian army and by launching rockets into the west side of the city. The target is a Syrian government army base in the semi-deserted industrial suburb of Ramusa. This group is well equipped, paid for and supplied by Gulf states, mainly Qatar. In the midst of battle, there's always a camera and a director. Everyone here filming their version of the truth.
الله أكبر. يا شباب كوك كوك.
The Syrians and the Russian Air Force bomb them to try to stop their advance. For the first time, the more moderate Syrian rebels are fighting alongside extremists formerly known as al-Nusra. They've come together because al-Nusra has recently rebranded, claiming to no longer support al-Qaeda. But the rebrand has been rejected by both the Russians and the West, who regard them as terrorists. After hours of fighting, they take the Syrian army compound. The defeated soldiers have already fled. There are celebrations and some trophy hunting. The fleeing government soldiers left behind a small group of civilians. For the benefit of the camera, we're assured these people were held under duress.
نظام علوي ما في بقلبه رحمة ولا في شفاء ولا عمرهم 4-5 سنين عم يحطون الشو ظروف بشرية بيننا وبينهم يعني هذول عم يحطهم بدل أكياس الدشم.
But they don't look particularly happy to have been liberated. Civilians stuck between two warring sides. In the end, it wasn't long before Ramusa was back under Syrian government control, helped by bombing from the Russian Air Force. Right now, the siege of East Aleppo continues. Moderates and extremists still shoulder to shoulder amid deepening sectarian hatred.
Krishnan Gurumurthy on the rebels of eastern Aleppo. Well, I've been speaking to the Prime Minister, Theresa May, about the situation on the ground in Syria.
Prime Minister, what message do you send a beleaguered child in Aleppo suffering the constant bombardment by Russian and Syrian jets day by day?
Well, first of all, the scenes that we're seeing from Aleppo are absolutely heartbreaking. And the levels of violence that are taking place, the way in which the Syrian regime is indiscriminately bombing its own civilians, of course, make it very difficult for a political transition to be discussed. But that's what we must continue to work on. We must continue to work on bringing the parties together in Geneva so that we can see a political solution, which is the only long-term solution we will have to the problems in Syria. But alongside that, we will continue to put pressure on all parties to ensure that humanitarian aid can get through to these beleaguered civilians. I mean, the policy that the Syrian regime has of starve or surrender is absolutely appalling.
The Russians and the Americans are no longer talking. Do we have a track to the Russians?
You're right that the talks between the Russians and the Americans have broken down. We continue to call for a ceasefire, and a ceasefire that can be sustainable so the parties can come together and work on that political transition, which we believe is absolutely essential for that long-term political solution in Syria. We will continue to work with international partners on that to try and find a way through this appalling situation, recognising all the time that it is people in Syria, people in Aleppo, who are suffering day by day.
But in truth, Britain has no real hand in this. There's nothing Britain can do.
Now, Britain has been playing its role. I mean, first of all, of course, the UK has been at the forefront of those who've been providing humanitarian aid for the refugees who've been fleeing Syria, providing humanitarian aid in the region. We're the second biggest bilateral donor. There are children being educated, there are medical supplies, food and water being supplied as a result of what the British taxpayer is doing. We also have been playing our role in the political and diplomatic efforts that have taken place in order to deal with the situation. Only a couple of weeks ago, it was here in London that we hosted opposition parties from Syria setting out their vision of the future of Syria. So the UK is playing its role, but what is key to this is that the Syrian regime stops bombing its own civilians indiscriminately in the way that it is, causing such suffering and hardship to its own people, and that Russia understands that we need to get humanitarian aid through. If Russia was to agree and to work for a ceasefire, then the parties could sit down and could start to work for the political transition that can bring the long-term solution.
The Prime Minister talking to me earlier, and we'll hear more from her later on the political and economic consequences of Brexit. Cathy.
Thanks, John. Well, as the United States breaks off its cooperation with Russia over Syria, what prospect is there of any real diplomatic progress? Kylie Morris joins me now from Washington. Kylie.
Well, Cathy, I've just been to the State Department where they've been going through what options they still have. The cupboard is not quite bare, but it's very close to it. They're talking again about a return to multilateralism, which means reaching out to partners on the International Syria Support Group, which meets tomorrow, to try and build some consensus again from the ground up. The reality is that President Obama has always shunned military options here in favour of working with local opposition groups. Now, those opposition groups, though, now are watching the Americans fail over and over again at achieving any kind of agreement, achieving any kind of a deal. So I put to the State Department how difficult it is for those rebels to continue to work with the Americans because of that.
We're going to continue, and we've maintained strong outreach to those moderate Syrian opposition groups. We've explained to them what's happening here. They've been
and what's their reaction?
Well, obviously, they're disappointed, but they're more disappointed, I can tell you, by Russia and the regime's actions.
It's a devastating failure, isn't it, of US foreign policy? I recognize that we are talking about Russian failures, but surely there are American failures here as well.
Well, I can't speak to, all the many options that might have been passed over on the way to where we are today, except to say that we've always believed that there's no military solution to the conflict in Syria.
Haven't we heard Secretary Kerry say that in the past he had lobbied for a military option, but no one was listening to him?
Look, I'm not going to speak to conversations that he did have in private with some of the Syrian opposition. But at the end of the day, you've got to balance the reality of what's happening on the ground with what your policy objectives are. And we all know that America has invested a great deal of blood and treasure in the Middle East and in that region, in the Gulf region, over the past 10 years. And so I think all of that goes into how we assess what our next options are with regard to Syria.
Well, Kylie, is there any reason to suggest that the Obama administration will change tack on military intervention?
Well, I think one of the main arguments for not intervening in the past has been that hope to build some kind of a peace deal with the Russians. That, for now, surely is exhausted. There is also very much a strong awareness here that watching Aleppo fall to the regime would look very bad for the Americans and be very bad for the civilians there. So there is increasing pressure on the president. However, thus far, very consistently throughout his presidency, he has refused to take America into the war any deeper in Syria. And one has to expect that he will maintain that position.
Kylie in Washington, thank you very much. John.
Well, with me in the studio now to discuss the West's involvement in Syria is Alexander Nekrasov, a former Kremlin advisor. We're joined from Paris by Bernard Kouchner, the former French foreign minister, founder of Médecins Sans Frontières, and from Washington by Danielle Pletka, who is the vice president of foreign and defense policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute. And before we come to the suffering on the ground in Syria, let me ask you, Alexander, what is the danger of an actual conflict between Russia and America over Syria? Men have died on both sides, correct?
Yes, it seems some of the Russian soldiers and officers and some of the Americans have been killed during the fighting around and in Aleppo. So it is very dangerous.
What, a strike on strike? Actual Americans killing Russians?
Well, according to some of the information, yes, there were casualties on both sides.
And Russians killing Americans in return?
Well, not specifically Russians. It were bombardments by Syrians and the Russians as well. So the problem is that we have a sort of a situation when a World War III is emerging from this conflict, in a sense that two superpowers, nuclear superpowers, are fighting each other now. And the danger is that the situation might get out of control, because unfortunately what we're seeing in the Western media is that we see a multi-sided conflict with one side, and I say one side, Russia and Syria, Syrian government forces, being blamed for everything. But in a multi-sided conflict, there are many, many sides, and many crimes are committed by other people as well. So we can't just say we blame one side for everything.
Well, let me pause you there. Bernard Kouchner, do you fear the possibility of outside forces like Russia, like America, actually entering into some kind of perhaps accidental conflict?
Well, you know, certainly, yes, there is a danger. But today, right now, we are at war. We, the alliance or the Occidental world, we are at war with Russia and with the allies of Russia. But by Syrian in the middle, who, I know that the victims are the victims, and I don't want the American killing the Russian and the Russian soldiers killing the American. But today, we are seated and they are dying facing us. And you say on the ground is full of blood, on the blood of the others. So is it possible? Who are we? Do we want to stop the war, or do we want to help one camp? And I remember that in 2013, it was possible to stop the war. Putin was not in. It was Mr. Bashar al-Assad, and President Obama said that they crossed the red line in bombing, chemically bombing their population. We did not. So is it possible now to stop by sending soldiers? No, this is impossible. It will, let's say, enlarge completely the conflict. Is it possible to stop the conflict? We tried. Not we, but the American and the Russian. They were talking in Geneva, Lavrov and Kerry. Was it possible in that time to believe to the truth, to believe to a ceasefire? Yes, we were hoping that. But in fact, it will be not possible to stop the alliance of Putin and Bashar getting a success in Aleppo. I'm very sorry for that. But how can we stop this bloody attack?
Well, that's the question I want to put.
We are killing the rest.
That's the question I want to put to Washington, to Daniel Pletka. Daniel Pletka, I sense that you resent President Obama for not taking military action.
Well, first of all, resent is not the right word. And no, the question is not whether we should take military action. The question is, from the moment this began in 2011, the United States and the Europeans, frankly, have had options that have systematically been closed off to us, where we could have helped people, we could have helped the moderate rebels, and we couldn't. We allowed the Russians to come in. We are the ones who permitted this to become so complicated because we were unwilling to stand up. And when I say we, yes, of course, at the top of the government is Barack Obama, but the Congress bears its fair share of blame, as does a feckless Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, who frankly have not advised the President about the perils, not just the strategic perils, but the moral perils of what he is watching indifferently happen in Aleppo and all over Syria.
Well, one senses he's agonizing about it too. I mean, Bernard Kouchner...
does one really?
Well, do you resent President Obama's role in this?
No, but I know about compassion fatigue. I know about peace is better than war. Okay, but meanwhile, since 2 years, Putin is the winner everywhere. Not only in Syria, not only in Middle East, but also in Ukraine, etc. How to resist to such a determination, to such a sort of permanent military threat? I know that this is very difficult. I know that we have to invent something, and we are, for let's say today, we are waiting for the attack on Mosul. Are we going to bomb Mosul? Certainly, yes. Bombing whom? The civilian population in Mosul. Is it better than bombing Aleppo and the civilian population in Aleppo? It seems to be very complicated to see who is fighting and who is not fighting. One group, the other, the Shiite and the Sunni, the Kurdish on one side and the other. We are in a very big mess, honestly. And it was a last hope that Kerry and Lavrov proposed us. Okay, we have to follow the same line and to try to get a truce and to get to better ceasefire. But I don't believe in now. It seems to be that we are sacrificing the rest of the resistance in Aleppo, resistant to Bashar, and the rest of the group are not better. I don't know. With the bad people and the good people in such a mess, this is impossible to say. We have to stop the war. How can we stop the war? In bombing? I'm not so sure.
But Alexander, the truth of the matter is Mr. Putin doesn't want to stop the war. He will go on and he will go through, and the danger is he will win, and you will not be unhappy about that.
Well, first of all, I don't understand this emotional sort of presentation.
Well, the emotion is fueled by the dying on the field.
Let me explain why the people are dying, the civilians. Because the rebels use them as human shields. Regular forces, the regular Syrian army, does not use civilians as human shields. The reason why civilians are dying is because in Aleppo, the rebels are sitting in the buildings with these people. All this talk about the Russians and the Syrians specifically targeting hospitals is lie. It's a lie. Why? Because the places that were bombed, they were not even marked as hospitals. These are bunkers where rebels are treating their own wounded, right? The moment something happens...
Well, you're not denying that civilians are being killed.
Civilians are being killed. This is a civil war in its ugliest, right? We have one side actually using civilians to shield themselves.
All right.
How can you not have casualties?
Well, Bernard Kouchner,
it's always the case in
Bernard
war.
Kouchner, let me put it to you. You are suddenly given the opportunity to do something. What would you do tonight if you had the power to do it?
Well, if we want to be moral, if we want a sort of ethic attitude, we don't have to talk to Bashar. But if we want to stop the war, I'm very sorry, it was not my position, but we have also to talk to Bashar and to talk to the rebels. If we want to stop the war, but for the time being, we are not stopping the war. We are using all the population, rebel and army and good people and bad people, just to follow the fight. In our name or not in our name, I don't know. If we want to stop the war, we have to talk to the people fighting each other, all of them.
Bernard Kouchner, thank you very much. But Danielle Pletka, would you advocate speaking now to Bashar Assad?
I wouldn't advocate speaking to Bashar al-Assad because I don't think that he's a candidate to be the leader of Syria any longer. And the problem there is if you begin to negotiate with him, his bottom line is that he wishes to remain. That's what this is all about. At the end of the day, what we need to do is what Mrs. Clinton has called for, what even Donald Trump at times has called for, which is we need a safe passage for civilians, we need a no-fly zone, we need an area where people can be, where they are safe from the fighting that is going on. That's the simplest step that we could take, and it is the right thing to do.
Daniel Pletka, Bernard Kouchner, Alexander Nekrasov, thank you very much indeed. And tomorrow night we'll have more in our series from inside Aleppo. We have an exclusive report from the other side of Aleppo, the government-controlled west. People here are scared, both of displeasing the Syrian regime, but also of an Islamist takeover of their city.
Now to the rest of today's news and to the Conservative conference, where Brexit still dominates proceedings, even though it's not on the official agenda. Party members arrived in the morning to the news that Theresa May's speech on Brexit had sent the pound to a new 31-year low against the dollar. In the hall, the Home Secretary Amber Rudd announced plans for a new, tougher policy on visas for overseas students. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, reports from Birmingham.
Conference, mark my words, we will make Brexit a success.
Maybe the repeated mantras had sent him into a trance. While the leader of the Welsh Conservatives was slipping up, the pound was dipping to a new low. The markets have been poring over Theresa May's words here on Sunday, where she all but ruled out Britain being a full member of the single market. Today, the focus here has been more on immigration. David Davis, the Secretary of State for exiting the EU, talked about the possibility of work permits and said employers who want low-skilled workers from the EU may well be asked to prove that they've already tried to get British citizens to do those jobs.
If they go down a route of having work permits, for example, typically the way a work permit works in other countries is you've got to say, have you tried to get a British citizen first? And if you haven't, then you've got to do that first. So there'll be tests like that.
Theresa May thinks the referendum result showed voters want only the most talented immigrants coming to this country. And today, Amber Rudd, her successor as Home Secretary, said the government might restrict overseas student numbers by shutting out those applying to lesser universities.
So our consultation will look at what more can we do to support our best universities and those that stick to the rules to attract the best talent, while looking at tougher rules for students on lower quality courses.
People outside the education part of government tend to think you can draw lines between different sorts of universities. People who work on education policy tend to think that's a much harder thing to do than the Home Office tends to think.
In her speech tomorrow, Theresa May wants to focus on help for struggling families, traditionally a centre-left issue. But it's the right-wing ministers in her government who are the real box office on the fringe here. There's a real focus on Brexit and on immigration. And it's right-wingers here who feel they're now in the ascendancy in this party. You feel you've got your party back.
And many people here do.
But doesn't that mean that somehow the British voters who voted David Cameron in have been disenfranchised?
No, the Tory party is still there, and don't forget people vote for individual members of Parliament.
But it's a different Tory party now. You feel it in the hall, don't you?
Of course it is, because the leadership has changed.
The Democratic Unionist Party of the late Ian Paisley's in town, offering temptations he would never have approved of. MP Ian Paisley Jr. chats with the Tory chief whip. DUP MPs are here cozying up to Theresa May's government. Is it possible we're looking at a new understanding? Pact even?
Well, I wouldn't use the pact word, but certainly we'll not be going out of our way to go against her, because she is, of course, adopting some of the policies that are already in existence in Northern Ireland. If you look at grammar schools, for example.
So she's now got a majority of 32 then, if you're with her.
We still, of course, will look at each issue on its merits, but in terms of the general direction of policy, there certainly seems to be a lot of synergies between where we're going and where she's going.
Not exactly where David Cameron thought he was taking his party, but the waters can cover you pretty quickly in Tory politics.
Well, while the government has been stressing the positives of Brexit, as we've heard, the currency markets have been far less optimistic. The pound has fallen to levels not seen in more than 3 decades. But the FTSE index of 100 leading companies has powered towards an all-time high. Our business editor, Siobhan Kennedy, is here. Siobhan, just explain this apparent contradiction between the currency market and the FTSE.
Well, it may seem confusing, Kathy, but actually it's quite logical. If you see here, the pound has indeed tanked since the weekend, and the Prime Minister's comments about Brexit and the perception that we're now headed for a hard Brexit, whereby we will pull out of the single market and be forced to negotiate the deals ourselves. Now, many investors feel that that will be, in the end, much worse for the British economy and for British businesses than if we'd managed to negotiate a deal to stay in. The flip side, of course, that has led to the FTSE steaming ahead, as you saw today, reaching a near all-time high. That is because a weaker pound is very good for those businesses who book their revenues overseas, typically in dollars, and then repatriate that money back to the UK, convert it to sterling, so they are literally getting a much bigger bang for their buck. That is why you've seen investors piling in today, buying the stocks of those companies. That's what's pushing up the FTSE. It's also why, Kathy, that good news feel is why the IMF today has upgraded its forecast for the UK growth for 2016 to now the fastest growth of any advanced economy.
Siobhan, thanks very much. John.
Well, when I spoke to the Prime Minister earlier, I asked what mandate she had to break last year's manifesto pledge of saying yes to the single market.
Well, on the 23rd of June this year, the British people were asked to give their voice, to give their view as to whether or not the United Kingdom should stay in the European Union. Parliament was clear. It voted 6-1 to give that choice, that voice to the British people. They came back with a clear message that they want the UK to leave the European Union.
Yeah, but the single market was not the question, was it?
They want the UK to leave the European Union, and that is what we are doing. What we now need to do is to negotiate the relationship that the UK will have with the EU once we have left. I want that relationship to be one in which there's the maximum possible opportunity for British businesses to trade with and operate within the single market in the European Union.
When it comes to those negotiations, why shouldn't Parliament be involved? It's surely for Parliament to determine what sorts of bits of the European Union we somehow want to retain a relationship with.
Well, we will be having, as I have recently announced, we're going to be putting before Parliament a great repeal bill which will set out the repeal of the European Communities Act, bring European Union law into UK law, so at the point at which we leave the EU, nobody will be in any doubt. Employers, workers will know what the situation is in relation to those laws.
But it feels very imperious at the moment, Prime Minister. Apparently, even before your statement on Sunday, there was a very cursory ring round of Cabinet members as to what you were actually going to say. There doesn't seem really to be very much democratic involvement in the actual detail of what you're doing.
Well, first of all, in looking at how we're going to negotiate leaving the European Union, I've created a new government department with the Secretary of State that will be focusing its efforts on that. We have a new cabinet subcommittee which brings secretaries of state together from a number of different departments to discuss how we approach this, to look at the process that we're following, to consider what we're hearing from sectors of industry, from businesses and others around the country, and from all parts of the United Kingdom, from the devolved administrations too. So everybody is fully engaged in the process of determining what the UK government is going to be putting before, doing in terms of the negotiations. But the negotiating party here is the UK government.
Well, you could argue that 48% didn't vote for this. How are they to be recompensed?
The majority vote was to leave the European Union. And, you know, as I talk to people around the country, as I talk to businesses and I talk to members of the public, the overwhelming message I get from people is that the vote has taken place A clear message has been given to the politicians to ensure that the United Kingdom leaves the European Union, and they want us to get on with it, and that's exactly what this government will do.
Final question, Prime Minister. The pound is down, back to the sort of levels it was at the time of the vote. The IMF have just downgraded the expectation for British growth next year. Is that what the Chancellor was describing as turbulence?
Well, the IMF have upgraded growth for the UK economy for this year, and they have made the point that
But you know better
actually,
than it's for next year that's the worry.
But they have also made the point that the reaction to the Brexit vote, to the referendum on June the 23rd, was actually reassuringly orderly, that it has been more orderly than I think many had predicted. But both the Chancellor and I have been clear that this is not going to be plain sailing in the future. There will be ups and downs, there will be some bumps in the road ahead. But we need to go out there and negotiate the best deal for the UK and be ambitious in doing that. I'm going to make a success of this. The UK people expect nothing less.
The Prime Minister talking to me earlier. Well, now, last year the government closed its Independent Living Fund, which had been set up to support severely disabled people to live independently rather than in residential care. Responsibility and money was transferred to local authorities in England, and this programme has now discovered that 80% have cut the funding for disabled people. Our social affairs editor, Jackie Long, has this exclusive report.
The fight to live independently is not one Dawn Cowley can win on her own. She needs help with every aspect of her daily routine, support partly paid for years by the Independent Living Fund. That fund has now been transferred to local councils, and Dawn's wants to cut her round-the-clock care package to around 35 hours a week, a move she's fighting. She says after paying for all the essential care she needs, she'll only be able to afford help to go out a few hours a week.
I'll be housebound, I'll be a prisoner. It's not just about being clean and sitting in front of a TV all day. People need to have a life. People need to be able to go out and do things. I'm still a relatively young woman. Why should I just have to be happy with just going out for 6 hours a week?
What about the argument that they need to make cuts? They simply can't afford to do what you would like them to do.
Well, the fact is that, okay, that's not really my problem. My condition is the same as it was 25 years ago. The ILAF money is still within the council. The fact that the government didn't say it had to be ring-fenced doesn't necessarily mean that the council can't see upon themselves that they should ring-fence it. I think they just want to use the money for all sorts of other things.
We sent freedom of information requests to all 150 local authorities in England with responsibility for social care. Around 90% responded. 67% have not ring-fenced the money, while more than 3/4 have cut the care packages of former Independent Living Fund users. And it all depends now on where you live. In Kirklees, for example, no one had a cut, but just next door in Oldham, 69% of people did.
Making us equal to other young people who would just be able to...
Hannah Lou Blackall knows all about the postcode lottery. After the Independent Living Fund was closed, Norfolk County Council cut her care package by 40%. She's just moved here to Hampshire to start a new job, but it means being reassessed. If she loses any more, working may just prove too difficult.
If I don't have 24-hour care support, then I can't work, and then I'm not paying tax. You get getting sort of mixed messages all the time. We want you to work, we want you to contribute to society, but actually we might not be able to fund your care. It's sort of...
And how important is it to be able to do what you think everybody else does?
People are, oh, well, why do you work? Why do you, why do you put yourself through, having to get everything in place to be able to work? But actually it's being, it's giving me something that isn't defined by my disability.
Good boy. Off you go that way. Good boy. For people like Hannah Lou, not being defined or confined by their disability was the whole point of the Independent Living Fund. The Department for Work and Pensions told us today,
we've given the entire £180 million English ILF budget to local authorities, and it's for them to decide how to administer this funding, as they know best how to support disabled people in their area.
There were a string of protests by disabled people about the transfer of the fund into local authority hands. Councils insist they are protecting the most vulnerable, but say government cuts mean they've got to do more for less, a situation unlikely to improve soon.
Next year, we will be in the pit of the bottom of the U-bend on funding, so it's going to be very difficult. Once you have lost services, they won't come back in a hurry, and it's going to be a real challenge for all local authorities who are dealing with social care.
And that's worrying for Hannah Lou. Her old authority, Norfolk County Council, said it had never been able to guarantee matching the Independent Living Fund, but has done its best. She's now got to wait to see what her new postcode delivers.
Jackie Long, the fiercest Caribbean storm in a decade has made landfall on Haiti. Hurricane Matthew brought heavy rain, storm surges as it battered the impoverished country this morning. One man died when the Category 4 storm crashed through his home in the southeast of the island.
The retrial of the footballer Ched Evans has begun in Cardiff. The 27-year-old is charged with raping a woman in a hotel in 2011. The judge warned the jury of 5 men and 7 women to disregard any publicity they'd previously seen or read. Our Home Affairs correspondent Andy Davies reports.
Ched Evans in Cardiff this morning. The former Sheffield United and Wales footballer hand in hand with his partner. She watched from the public gallery as he returned to the dock to be tried once again for an alleged rape in 2011. Previously convicted for the offence, Ched Evans successfully appealed it. That's when the Court of Appeal ordered this retrial. Rape is an emotive subject, said the prosecuting barrister to the 7 women and 5 men on the jury this afternoon. He asked them to put aside any preconceptions they had, acknowledging that they'd probably heard of Ched Evans. There's been a lot of commentary around this case, he told them. Much of it, he said, ill-informed and malicious. He then outlined the prosecution case, claiming that it was in a hotel room in Rhyl in North Wales over 5 years ago when Ched Evans raped a young woman. She was heavily intoxicated, jurors heard, and had gone back to the hotel with a friend of Mr. Evans, Clayton MacDonald, who, it's alleged, earlier rang Ched Evans from his taxi to say, "I've got a girl," or words to that effect. Mr. MacDonald would also be charged with rape, but was acquitted at the first trial. The woman had been drinking with friends in the town earlier that night. She remains convinced her drink was spiked, the court heard. If it had been, there was no evidence at all, said the prosecuting counsel, that Ched Evans spiked her drink. But he did rape her, said the barrister.
We submit that she was that intoxicated, for whatever reason, that she didn't really know what on earth was happening. It is not a proper description, we suggest, to say that he had sex with her. It is more accurate to say that he did sex to her. Sex without consent is rape.
Jurors were told Ched Evans later slipped away into the night through the fire escape door. He denies the charge of rape. The trial is expected to last 2 weeks.
Andy Davis reporting.
After the break, it was a story that shocked Britain in the 1940s. The love affair between an African prince and a white British woman is the subject of a new film. I've been talking to its star about attitudes to race then and now.
Can we do this again?
Welcome back. The British actor David Oyelowo achieved global fame when he played Martin Luther King in the film Selma a couple of years ago. Nominated for various awards, he missed out on an Oscar nomination, triggering a row about institutional racism in Hollywood. His latest film, A United Kingdom, opens at London Film Festival tomorrow and recalls the racism in Britain in the late 1940s.
He's cleverer than him, and he's black.
A United Kingdom tells the extraordinary true story about a couple whose love affair changed the destiny of an entire country. Seretse Khama was an African prince who, while studying law at Oxford, fell in love with an Englishwoman, Ruth Williams.
My grandfather was a king. I am his heir. I have a responsibility to return home to my people. I will never achieve anything worthwhile if I leave my heart here.
They married in the face of opposition not only from Ruth's family, but also the British and South African governments. not to mention Soretsi's own people in his native Botswana.
Have you no shame?
More than half a century after they challenged convention and changed the course of history, David Oyelowo, the British Nigerian who plays Soretsi, found Hollywood still struggling to root out racism.
I'm married to a white lady myself. I'm sure there have been areas in my life, in fact, I know there have been areas in my life I've been marginalized, not necessarily because of my marriage, but because of the color of my skin.
Which areas would you say?
Professionally, I mean, you know, the fact that a film like this is tougher to get made is absolutely centered around the fact that you have a black protagonist.
That's scandalous, isn't it, that that's still such a challenge?
It's scandalous, but it's been with us for a while. I mean, films that have been made about the African continent, by and large, have had a foreign protagonist as the center, a white protagonist, and you often will have the African characters, the black characters, on the periphery of the narrative. That, the thinking behind that is that a Western audience needs an entry point. They need someone to relate to. To me, the idea that Soretsi falling in love with someone like Ruth is something a white person somewhere couldn't relate to is ridiculous, but that's been the rationale.
So Hollywood is still working on the diversity issue, clearly.
No question, no question, and I think that's to do with the perspective of the people who are getting to tell the stories. I think what you see in movies is very much the perspective of those who have green light power, those who are sanctioning what gets made and what doesn't. And until the demographics of the decision makers change, we are not going to see enough movies, TV programs, media that reflects the society we actually live in.
Does that make you angry? I mean, you seem very measured talking about it.
It doesn't make me angry because I'm doing something about it. You know, as a producer, getting a film like A United Kingdom made, being part of getting a film like Selma made, championing female directors and black stories, African stories, is the way to not be angry.
I am told that you no longer wish for me to honor my duty as your king.
You were born in England, you now live in the States. Do you feel that the UK is a more united kingdom, to coin a phrase, when it comes to race than America is, when you look at hundreds of African Americans getting killed by the police, for example?
If you asked me that before Brexit, I would have said yes. I have a brother who still lives here, and he is now hearing phrases that I haven't heard of since my dad moved here in the 60s and 70s. He is hearing people say things like, go back to where you came from. And that wasn't the case 6 months ago.
I am ready to serve you because I love my people. I love this land. But I love my wife.
And it's about time that we had a black James Bond, isn't it?
It is, and I think Idris is fantastic.
You're ruling yourself out.
I'm not ruling myself out, but I think Idris is fantastic.
David Oyelowo, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We're back tomorrow at 7, but for now, that's Channel 4 News. Good evening.
Good evening.